Well, on the long boat from China, I apparently picked up a bug, so please forgive me if my voice is cracking or if I'm coughing and carrying on or if I happen to faint. No, I'm not quite that bad. Also, I am not a Philip Larkin expert, and so I'm very happy to be here and to learn from all of you. So I'll be talking a bit about kind of the metafictional fantasy aspects of the novel Jill. So real quickly, we'll be looking at sort of what is the critical sort of context for what I'll be talking about, making a distinction between high fantasy escape and escapism, and then looking briefly at sort of the epistolary literary elements, and particularly John Kemp's epistolary fantasy, and then his kind of comical Künstlerroman as he develops into this type of epistolary fantasy writer, and then concluding with what he actually recovers, if anything, from his escapism, which would be nihilism. Okay. So real briefly, some of the dominant critical views that we see with the readers and scholars looking at the novel Jill is first looking at both Jill and Girl in Winter as a kind of intermediary juvenilia writing between his works as Brunette Coleman and then his later poetry. Right? That's a common thread in the scholarship that I saw. Or we have readers who simply just dismiss it as aesthetically challenged and narratively problematic, which is always just a troublesome book, There are also other, what I would consider more measured analyses of the novel, looking at it in this proper context of juvenilia, right? That is a whole kind of literary genre that we can look at, and with its own proper contextual elements, right? And so looking at aesthetic style narratology as juvenilia, which I think is a bit fairer if you're going to look, judge or critique a book in terms of its being juvenilia. Also, kind of more obvious, the autobiographical elements that we see, of course, Philip Larkin as a student at Oxford. Also, the influences of D.H. Lawrence on the narrative structure and thematic elements of the text. And some key figures would be Richard Bradford, Andrew Motion, and James Underwood, who take these more measured approaches to the text. Some common thematic considerations would be, of course, issues of class difference, and alienation among the World War II Oxford students, and these are representative figures who have explored those themes. And then gender representations and gender roles within a novel, and also issues of homosexuality and lesbianism. So kind of the critical context and focus that I would like to look at is a less explored theme, and that would be the metafictional and fantasy elements of the novel. Now, Bradford and Underwood both do look at some kind of metafictional elements in terms of John Kemp as a representation of a Larkin and his own authorial anxieties. Right, so that's kind of a metafictional issues. And Cooper briefly mentions John's writerly transition from fantasy to a form of realism. So we do have some of that. But I think an unexplored theme that I would like to look at is the sort of metafictional representation of what I would call a failed escapist fantasy writing. So my focus is going to be on John Kemp as a writer who engages what I would like to call epistolary fantasy that results in a kind of failed escapism. And so the critical context that I would like to use as a framework would be Tolkien's formulation of high fantasy literature as imaginative escape that results in recovery of lost truths and concerns and elements, and then a type of consolation and transformation of self. So I was thinking about would this even work, and why would that be important? Well, one, because of course Tolkien is key in terms of defining fantasy elements in his famous lecture on fairy stories. But also in reading through letters of Philip Larkin, I discovered that both Tolkien and C.S. Lewis were on on Philip Larkin's exam board as he finished up at Oxford. And so I thought, oh, look at that. And he actually, in one of his letters, mentions, like, God bless them, because he actually scored higher than what he was expecting to score. So I thought that was a neat connection that I discovered there. So my thesis then would be John's writing of letters to a fictitious figure, Jill, who's first his sister and then a friend, develops a short story, and then creates a fictitious letters and diaries written by this Jill figure. They represent a limited fantasy subcreation, which is a big thing for Tolkien, right? A limited fantasy subcreation that brings no consolation, but rather results in physical violence, illness, and existential crisis. So let's first kind of look at this context of escape versus escapism. So there's a wonderful quote from Tolkien on escape from On Fairy Stories. He writes, "I have claimed that escape is one of the main functions of fairy stories, and since I do not disapprove of them, it is plain that I do not accept the tone of scorn or pity with which escape is now so often used. Why should a man be scorned if, finding himself in prison, he tries to get out and go home? Or if he cannot do so, he thinks and talks about other topics than jailers and prison walls." So there's this value to escape that Tolkien is talking about here. And so what he does is he tries to make a distinction. So he's often or sometimes viewed as merely advocating escapism through fantasy literature. But actually, he distinguishes between escapism and escape. So escapism or escapist literature is using the imagination to flee from reality and to ignore socio-political concerns of the contemporary society, or to avoid personal responsibility to society and civic duties. And that's not what Tolkien is talking about. Escape for Tolkien is engaging the imagination in order to move from the real into the fantastic, in order to recover lost truths, concepts, ideas, perspectives, and then bring them back into the realm of the real in order to effect healing, change, and consolation within the everyday. So we can, what I would like to do is analyze Kemp's fantasy escape in terms of this definition that Tolkien developed. But also I would like to kind of frame it a bit differently, because John Kemp is writing what we might call epistolary literature, right? And so epistolary literature, of course, is just literature that's written as a series of fictional letters, often written between characters within the story. And this literary tradition actually goes back to ancient Greek and Roman literatures. But in terms of Western literary development, especially the novel, it's the 18th and the 19th century where we see the epistolary novel becoming a very important genre and narrative structure. And so one of the objectives of writing epistolary novels is the ability of the writer to then kind of experiment with narrative voice and experiment with narrative perspective, instead of relying on an objective third-person narrative perspective or exclusively a first-person limited perspective. And so this particular narrative format provides the opportunity to create multiple narrative perspectives. Right? You're getting stories from a variety of perspectives in the characters as represented through the letters that they're writing to each other. And through this multiple perspectives, the characters and the overarching kind of narrative voice, if you will, can question or ask questions of what is reality, what is truth, what is identity and subjectivity, how do we know these various things, particularly as you start to compare what the people are saying about the same individual or the same story or the same event from their own subjective perspectives. And so, interestingly, in the 18th and 19th centuries, we have what we might call a pre-postmodern concern about identity and representations of reality. So then we can look at what John Kemp is doing in his epistolary fantasy. He's writing a kind of wish fulfillment, right? Fantasy narratives in the form of these fictitious letters that are supposedly real figures, right? He's trying to pass them off to Christopher as if they're real figures. Now, interestingly, Larkin considered cutting this aspect out of the novel. In one of his letters to Kingsley Amis on November 8, 1943, he writes, "The only bits which please me are the schoolgirl bits, the diary and the short story that he writes. But I fancy they will have to be cut out. A little twerp, a little twerp like John Kemp couldn't possibly think of anything so subtly perverse." So that's a wonderful little bit there. Thankfully, he did not edit it out, because I think for me it was one of the most interesting, engaging aspects of that novel. So he's writing sort of a postmodern metafictional elements before that became a thing, right? And so I think that's very, very interesting. So how does John Kemp develop as this kind of a writer? So we might look at what I would call a comical Künstlerroman, right? The development of him as an artist and a writer. So first we have what everyone sort of picks up on, obviously, is just sort of this very pathetic self-esteem within John Kemp. Some people are really annoyed by that aspect. Other people find sympathy. But we have this, this nearly invisible identity in which he's ignored. He's bashful. He's very timid with the strangers in his own room, right? There's that presumptuous tea party where they're using his crockery and they're ignoring that he even exists or referring to him in the third person, right? But he continues to be like timid in the midst of this dismissal and insult and inconsiderate behavior. So, quote, "He was acutely conscious of being referred to in the third person, but it expressed his mood. While being trapped in their laughter, he only wanted to drag himself stiffly away and hide." And sometimes I just want to shake him. Come on, get a grip. There are, of course, several other examples of his timidity and fear at his new surroundings. And it explains his desire for escape. It's very understandable that he would want to kind of slink away either into other places of Oxford or into his imagination. Right? And so we can understand him wanting to replace his own reality. So he becomes kind of the perfect literary candidate for seeking fantasy escape from the frustrations and abuses of his everyday life. So he starts this journey towards being an epistolary fantasy writer by first fantasizing the real. Right? He recasts his own real experiences in his own mind. So, for example, there's this vicarious reimagining of Christopher and his friends' reminiscences. Right? He's listening to them reminisce about what they were doing when they were younger. Quote, "It seemed to him that in their school days, they had won more than he would ever win during the whole of his life." That itself is just pathetic to think that he would never achieve anything as great as what they've already done in their school days, right? At first ill-treated, they had lived to be oppressors, whose savagest desires could be gratified at once, which was surely the height of ambition. As the picture grew in his mind, he ornamented it with little marginal additions, until in the end the thing was as unreal as a highly colored picture of an ancient battle. But he had no inkling of its untruth, and he looked on them with curious respect. So it's kind of the idea of history becomes legend, legend becomes myth, right? He's mythologizing their own lives within his mind as he's listening to what they're talking about. And then, of course, there's the kind of mother fantasy with Mrs. Warner. Christopher is too busy playing football, and so asks John to go pick his mother up at the train station. And he shows her around, and he starts to fantasize about belonging to their family, right? And she being his mother. So while they're eating, it says, "He himself ate but did not talk, sitting not dumb with fright, but naturally silent, as if watching an actress on the stage. her least action was a pleasure to watch. So he's transformed her in his own mind into a person of artifice, someone who is acting on a stage, right? He's recast her, and purpose of use of recast, right? And then, of course, there's this idea of how he wants to change his exterior in order to mask and hide and pretend to be someone else, right? So he starts to behave at lectures like his former teacher, Mr. Crouch. He imagines being Christopher at pubs. But all that is kind of shattered when he sees himself in the reflection of the hat shop. And so he just says, I need new clothes, right? Maybe that will make me into this other figure. So he thinks these new clothes will communicate externally a desired identity, masking the reality of his own empty, unremarkable self. Right? And so all that he can afford, though, is a bow tie. And he ties it rather poorly. And so he's out in public, and he has that whole, funny yet delightful yet disturbing scene with Elizabeth, where she's very flirtatiously, retying his bow tie. But that emphasizes, one, he doesn't know what he's doing. He can't dress himself to impress, and he's befuddled by her attractiveness and her flirtation. So it's just this huge public fiasco for him, right? So with this fantasy being broken, he's left rather bitter and disillusioned. And so he starts to engage in literary escapism. He creates kind of a delusional false narrative that brings more disillusionment instead of consolation. So he writes the fictional letters as an act of retribution. He's trying to get back at Christopher, right? He's trying to confound Christopher. He's confused. What are these letters and who are they from? And you didn't tell me about all these aspects of your life. But in these letters that are supposedly real, he's completely recasting himself, his own life, into an alternate reality, right? Where he's clever, he's in command, he's the one who knows about the literary elements, he's writing these great papers and so on, right? So he's in these letters that he's posing as real, he's already recasting himself as this great figure. And this escapism further encourages avoidance of his life and denial of true resolutions of his problems. So failed fantasy escape here brings no recovery or any consolation. This sort of dynamic becomes even more accentuated when he basically creates his own Pygmalion myth, right? The figure Jill morphs from being a fictional sister into this sort of fantasy teenage girl. So the act of writing Jill ends up morphing into conjuring, and strangely it seems, even channeling someone else with a very different personal and emotional significance. So critics have talked about how this is very much like Larkin's own brunette Coleman pseudonym, right? So he takes on this female writer identity. And then Jillian, curiously, is this physical manifestation of the girl that Kemp has been creating through his own epistolary fantasy, and then kind of fleshing out with this fictional context where he writes this whole story, and then he develops the diary. He starts to write in her own voice his whole diary, right? So he's really fleshing out this fantasy figure. And Kemp then becomes a kind of voyeuristic artist, right? He's gazing through the bookshelves at his Pygmalion creation, and this further fuels his own fantasy about her. But instead of returning from the fantasy to engage the real, he continues to maintain and indulge the fantasy. And this is further example of his failed escapism. So then, of course, it kind of culminates in this climactic kiss and corresponding punch in the mouth, right? Which is wonderfully, I think, wonderfully described. So John stood back. In the weak light, his face was quite expressionless. Everything seemed at that moment clear and restful. As Jill came level, he took her quietly in his arms and kissed her. Elizabeth gasped something. I love that. You wonder what she gasped, right? But he leaves it to your imagination. So this climactic moment in the novel identifies John as a failed metafictional figure of mere escapism. Right? And sadly, Kemp continues to indulge this failed escapist fantasy during his recovery. Right? He keeps on trying to build that it's almost grotesque kind of fantasy within his mind without ever realizing, why he's in the sick bed to begin with. So this we can see as a kind of metafictional failed fantasy. The novel presents us with a young Philip Larkin writing about a young Oxford student who strives through escapist literature to fashion his own Pygmalion beauty that he then confuses with the underage Gillian, acting out of his fantasized desires in the real world where there are real moral consequences, namely physical retribution in the form of the punch in the mouth, and then continued social alienation. So by way of conclusion, so we see that Kemp's own fantasy writing is mere escapist. Right? It brings no consolation for him, but rather results in physical violence, illness, and existential crisis. High fantasy, according to Tolkien, brings personal consolation by reaffirming such permanent things, according to Tolkien, as virtue, love, honor, self-sacrifice, nobility. But Kemp's escapism indulged a kind of childish lust and brings a renewed existential angst. He decides that all personal choice and free will are but illusions, and that human existence is overdetermined by impersonal, amoral, disinterested fate. Right? It's a very kind of dark ending in that sense. So such a philosophical recovery from this escape is antithetical to Tolkien's notion of consolation, and thus his failed escapism. However, as Ross Barber highlighted this morning, this very sort of nihilistic fear of death is something that Larkin, I think, hints at here, but then grapples with his entire life, his whole writing career, and thus we could say he grapples with it his whole life. All right, thank you much.